The opinions expressed on this program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University.
Hello and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. Free speech and free inquiry in America are enshrined in the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The freedom to challenge and criticize leaders is crucial in democracy and also crucial in the university, where economists, philosophers, and other scholars attempt to advance our knowledge and sometimes challenge some of our most fundamental beliefs. And yet the value of free speech is being questioned today as it hasn't been for decades. Why is free speech important? One of the classic answers to this question was given by British political economist and philosopher John Stuart Mill in his book On Liberty. What was Mill's argument, and does it still have relevance in America today? To address this question, the Johnson Center is pleased to bring to Troy University one of the leading scholars on Mill, Dr. Manuel Jacobson. Dr. Jacobson is a professor of philosophy at the University of Michigan. He studied mathematics and philosophy at Yale University as an undergraduate and then earned a PhD in philosophy from the University of Michigan. He's written extensively on Mill's philosophy and specifically on the argument for free speech and free inquiry. Welcome to Troy, Dr. Jacobson, and welcome to EconVersations.
Thanks for having me.
Well, what we're talking about today is free speech, and it's something that has a cherished position in the United States, as enshrined as it is in our First Amendment, but that's not necessarily the case in all other countries, right?
That's right. In fact, a lot of legal academics in the United States look at freedom of speech as some kind of American aberration, and suggest that the European view of matters is more sophisticated and that we should be less absolutist about freedom of speech.
And the First Amendment packages freedom of speech along with several other very important freedoms, like freedom of religion and freedom of the press, right? So and freedom of expression as well, correct?
That's right.
And so we have a little bit in here, but one of America's founders were actually quite well read in political economy, and so they didn't create our Constitution out of nothing, but out of a pretty solid grounding of I guess liberal political theory at the time, right?
That's right. Of course, the First Amendment came to be read as expansively and as protecting freedom of speech as absolutely as it has, only over time, in part under the influence of arguments for the philosophical foundations of freedom of speech made by people like John Stuart Mill.
Well, okay, so it's Mill came a little bit after our founding fathers, so he didn't influence them then. But tell us a little bit about Professor Mill, or John Stuart Mill.
Yeah. Interestingly, John Stuart Mill was never a professor or a professional philosopher. He was prevented from being a professor at English universities because at the time you had to swear an oath to the 39 Articles of the Church of England in order to be a professor. His teacher and mentor, Jeremy Bentham, did that and then recanted. And Mill never did. He was always against oaths. He pointed out that compelling speech, forcing people to swear oaths, only deters the honest, not those who are willing to lie in order to advance themselves.
It's interesting because I remember reading that passage on liberty, but I didn't realize that it was so personal in that regard.
It applied to his life, absolutely, yeah. So Mill, just to give you the brief biography, Mill was a 19th century English philosopher. As you said, he's well known for two particular reasons. He was one of the first generation of utilitarians who believe that the rightness and wrongness of actions is in some way or other determined by their consequences, by their utility. And he was also one of the most important figures in the development of liberalism, classical liberalism as it's called now, a philosophy that stresses individual rights, personal responsibility, and political and economic freedom. And some people, in fact, have seen those two strands in Mill as being in tension, since they think that they wonder how it is that a utilitarian like Mill can support as strong a doctrine of individual freedom as Mill defends in On Liberty.
So Mill actually had a very lengthy and I think well thought out argument on why free speech was so important, and it had several different parts to it, right?
Yeah, that's right. That is the central case that he uses in On Liberty to discuss the sphere of individual liberty. That's really the crux of Millian classical liberalism, the idea that each individual has a circle in which what they do really primarily concerns themselves and can't properly be compelled by others, either legally or socially, by the state or by society.
Now, one part of his argument for free speech involves the role of free speech and the ability to criticize others in the pursuit of knowledge for us as a species. The only way that we're going to end up knowing stuff, knowing what's possibly knowing what's true, is for it to have this clash of ideas, right?
That's right. The way that Mill reconciled his utilitarianism with his defense of freedom of speech was because he held that the advancement of knowledge and holding our ideas as active convictions rather than what he called dead dogmas that we don't really think about and just accept and never question, never integrate into our motives and our lives. One of the things that he thought was necessary for mental flourishing and the flourishing of the individual was that we expose ourselves to ideas that we're opposed to, test our opinions against the strongest things that can be said against them. Only that in that way can we be justified in having them and can really have knowledge. Okay.
Yeah, so at the level of society, we need to know what the best objections to what we think is actually true would be, to know whether we are actually confident in what we believe. Right?
Yeah, exactly. One of Mill's insights, I think Mill had a number of insights that have been vindicated by modern psychology. And one of them, which you see all the time in discourse, especially discourse online, but also even between experts on TV, and Mill thought that this held of even educated people at his time, is that he says the worst part of everyone's argument is what he intends as an answer to his opponents. That is, Mill thought that one of our blind spots was in understanding well enough what the best antagonistic arguments were. He thought that the only way to get beyond that, the only way to test our views was through what he calls adverse discussion with people who disagree with you. And the danger is adverse discussion is unpleasant. People try to avoid it. People surround themselves with sources, whether they're informational sources or other people who agree with them. They seek out confirmation of their views, not facts or arguments that threaten them. And the trouble is that that means that all of us humans have these tendencies that run counter to our developing our minds as well as we could.
And if you are coming up with knowledge that's going to challenge the status quo in some ways, as these gentlemen here, Copernicus and Galileo did, I mean, Copernicus put forward the theory of that the sun was at the center of the universe and not the earth, and that challenged the authorities at the time. And I mean, none of us like to be criticized, I suppose. That's very natural as humans, and those in power, or those who believe they know, the holders of the received wisdom, don't want to be criticized as well, right?
Of course, no one likes criticism, and even less than criticism, we don't like to be punished or threatened with punishment. The interesting thing for Mill is, although his argument is meant to hold that there ought to be universal toleration of all opinions, the profession and advocacy of all opinions, the false, the immoral, even the harmful, he's very much in favor of criticism. He says rather than suppress ideas, bad ideas, what we should do is criticize them. That's better both for the people who hold the bad ideas and for those who don't, who thereby get to hear what's wrong with ideas that they would like to reject, that they do reject, but often that they don't understand how best to reject.
And one theme that Mill raises is the issue of free speech is important because people are not infallible. And he often refers to this idea that, well, we have to assume that we are infallible to know what is the truth and what isn't the truth, and that's a very important point to keep in mind. I mean, none of it, and I think it's very important because all of us often not only don't want to think that we're wrong, but sometimes we think we're maybe smarter than we are, and we, especially those in power, might think that they are infallible, right?
Yeah, this is one of the respects in which I think Mill's argument really anticipates some of the developments of modern psychology. We've been shown there's a lot of evidence that as humans we're subject to various forms of cognitive bias that make intellectual and political diversity really necessary in order for us to be well-founded in our beliefs. Those biases include just a tendency towards conformity, towards wanting to fit in with what people are like in our society and what people believe in our society. What's called confirmation bias, which is a prejudiced look at the evidence where we tend to notice the things that confirm what we believe and ignore or don't notice or downplay the things that conflict with what we believe. One way that it's been put is when you believe something, you look for things that will vindicate it. When you don't believe it and you come across some evidence, you treat that evidence as by asking, well, how can I still believe what I believe? How can I accept this without changing my beliefs? Finally, there's a lot of data that shows that when we're in social groups that think alike, there's this tendency called group polarization, which is that a group of people who hold the same belief will become more radicalized by the process of discussion. So discussion is supposed to justify our beliefs better. It's supposed to make us think better. But if we're in a group of people who think too similarly, what it does is, and this is a factor that infects people on the left and the right. This is a human-wide phenomenon. It's not one party or one ideology. When people are in an intellectually diverse group, a group where people hold different opinions, they tend to moderate after discussion. When they're in a group who all think alike, they tend to become more extreme in their discussion. I think that's behind a lot of the polarization that people have talk about a lot and complain about a lot in today's discourse.
Another thing another element of Mill's argument is not simply that we need to confront truth and falsehood to figure out what's true, but that as human beings, this is a really important element, being able to have opinions and express opinions, and because it's not just enough necessarily to be able to have an opinion if you can only keep it locked in your head. At some level, to really say you believe something, you have to be able to take some actions based on that belief as well, right?
That's right. Mill thought that the liberties of conscience, liberty of thought, and freedom of speech were, he calls it, practically inseparable, that is, inseparable in practice. And that's mystified a lot of people because, of course, you can have an opinion and keep quiet. We don't always have to speak our mind, but Mill understood not only the benefits to yourself and to society of speaking your mind, but also that there's a way in which ne you're forced to keep your views to yourself, you betray yourself in a sense. The only way to express who you really are is to make public your convictions, even the ones that are unpopular.
Yeah, because I know, sometimes when you're forced to remain silent, it is somehow a little bit demeaning, and it is probably like a really important part of us, our human dignity, and that is important that we be able to express our opinions.
Mill uses the term dignity a lot, and I think he would agree with you entirely about that. Being forced into silence does feel like a betrayal of yourself.
And then a third element of it is, well, certainly whether it be important in democracy, but also elsewhere, the importance of freedom of speech is the ability to criticize those in power, criticize government, and it would be particularly significant if you were to live in a democracy, but also, ultimately it was people in East Germany that criticized the government, and eventually were able to, just about 30 years ago, bring down the Berlin Wall. And it's that freedom to be able to criticize those in power, especially remembering that, as we see today, people in power don't like to be criticized, and would have a sort of a very natural inclination to want to hit back or try to silence their critics. Right?
Of course, that's true. That's one of the reasons that freedom of speech is so central to political liberty. What's also true, of course, is that the alternative to freedom of speech, the things that you see in Europe and other countries that aren't at all dictatorships or totalitarian, that don't control everyone's thought, nevertheless criminalize or prohibit certain forms of speech. What you see there, of course, is it's politicians ultimately who decide what sort of speech they're going to allow and what sort of speech they're going to punish. That's often extremely vague. You can't know beforehand whether what you're going to say is going to be judged to fall on the wrong side of the line of something like hate speech, say. So even people who are trying to obey the law find themselves chilled in what they can say. And it's, though obviously criticism of the government isn't prohibited in European countries, nevertheless, I think it really is a significant impingement on people's political freedom to have types of opinions that are punished, prohibited, and for which just the discussion of them, not even the advocacy of them, is criminalized.
Now, one thing that's important to mention is that in the U.S., our idea of the First Amendment and censorship is something we usually apply to the government. But today, we see what's sometimes referred to as almost censorship emerging sort of in online discussions when people react very hostily, or very angrily to speech by others. And so what was Mill's thinking on this idea of censorship? Was it only the government that could censor, or what was the role for criticism of criticism in his way of thinking?
Great. One of the most important differences between Mill's argument for freedom of speech and First Amendment jurisprudence, the law in the United States when it comes to freedom of speech, is that the First Amendment protects us against government censorship, as you say. Mill's idea was broader than that. He wanted to protect speech against all forms of punishment, not just legal prohibition, but also social punishment. Now, this is a trick, and Mill recognized it. That is, this is a tricky thing to do because he very much wanted to inculcate a robust form of criticism. That's how we become justified in our beliefs. So if you don't like what I say and you criticize me, of course, if I'm too thin-skinned, I might take that as being punishment. Right. I won't like it. Mill is very much in favor, though, of adverse discussion, as he calls it, the discussion in which ideas clash. He just wanted to rule out shaming sorts of punishments, where we get together and won't speak to you, make you a pariah because you hold a certain political view that we want you to either to change or to shut up about.
Now, today, as you mentioned, and there are poll results to show this, people seem to be questioning the value of free speech in America more than ever, certainly in my memory that I can recall. Although, actually, I think we know that the true exercise of freedom of speech, when it's going to conflict with the opinion of the majority, has always been problematic and always been frowned upon, at the very least. But I mean, what are some of the arguments that people are making today to sort of suggest that maybe we need to rein back free speech in the United States?
A lot of people are confused about what the law really is. Howard Dean, for instance, the former presidential candidate, claimed that hate speech was illegal, which is just false as a matter of doctrine. It's true that the First Amendment has certain very narrowly tailored restrictions on speech that are point of view or perspective neutral. So there's a doctrine known as the fighting words doctrine, which basically says I can't insult you to your face in the kind of way that's just less of an exchange of ideas as provoking a fight. But one of the ways in which freedom of speech comes under attack is by people trying to come up with categories of speech, such as hate speech, where that's not understood in this narrow, perspective neutral way, but understood as certain types of opinion that they deem to be hateful or otherwise harmful, and to say, no, we're going to punish you for saying that. We're going to prohibit that. The trouble, of course, is that it's always a political decision what counts as that, and you thereby incentivize people to say, if you express an idea, a political idea or a moral idea that I find abhorrent, if I can characterize that as hate speech, then maybe I can get I can get you punished for saying it, or I can scare you out of opposing me. So it's true that freedom of speech right now is under attack by people who say, well, what's the value in hate speech? It's false, it's immoral, it's harmful. The reason that Mill defended all opinions, even the false, the immoral, and the hateful, is in part because of a fundamental distrust of letting decisions about what kind of speech were going to be tolerated be decided by political means. Because of course it's a political decision that's going to be decided by politicians. He feared the tyranny of the majority as well as the tyranny of the minority.
But if we go a little bit further in terms of whether, because proponents of restrictions on hate speech would, I think, tend to try to say that certain words, certain lines of arguments, especially racial epithets or other types of speech, some very narrow forms of speech, really hurt minorities, and it hurt in a way that isn't going to be really contributing to the kind of discourse or the exchange of ideas or confronting falsehood with truth. You're talking about some speech that could hurt probably just as much as if somebody took a swing at somebody. That the pain you feel from some forms of speech, especially for minorities that have faced discrimination over the years, is probably very real. And if we can agree that racism is wrong, then what's the harm in restricting some of this speech?
So I wanted to grant, as Mill did, just to accept that speech can be hurtful, it can be offensive, and that can do harm. I would prefer a very minor physical pain to major emotional offense, the kind that one can take from the expression of foul opinions, that I deem offensive. So part of what's interesting about Mill's defense of freedom of speech is it doesn't deny that speech can do harm. It just holds that we have to consider what the alternatives are, and when we consider the alternatives, we'll see that they don't actually help and that they're counterproductive. So let's take epithets. On the one hand, when Mill is defending the right to express any opinion, even false, immoral, and hateful ones, you might think, well, we can rephrase without an ugly epithet, a racial epithet, any idea that someone puts forward. We can make it less offensive just by banning certain words. And while it's true that the idea that all opinions have to be tolerated might not be undermined immediately by banning 6-10 words as being a doctrine kind of like fighting words. These are just epithets that we're just going to ban from use in society. The trouble with that is how counterproductive it so predictably would be. Because look what happens with words. Language is malleable. Language changes. If you're really will throw me in jail or punish me for using this word, then of course I'm not going to use this word again. If I want to express some foul idea or something, I'll find another word. And then the in-group, the people who want to express the hateful idea, will just express it with that word rather than this word. And it will turn out that there's no way of avoiding that kind of offensiveness that genuinely comes from epithets.
One other thing I want to touch on here is the idea that, and I guess this goes back to Mill's point about truth confronting falsehood, but you make the point in some of your writing that in European countries, and many European countries have made it illegal to try to deny the Holocaust, the existence of the Holocaust, for some decades. And certainly, I don't think any rational person, any reasonable historian could possibly attempt to try to do this. But you point out that banning Holocaust denial hasn't exactly made the view go away, has it?
It hasn't. It doesn't help to drive opinions underground. That I think we can see from the experience of Europe and its confrontation with the Holocaust and with the Nazis. If anything, I think that when you make an opinion esoteric, when you don't allow it to be spoken and criticized publicly, you give it a kind of glamour, a kind of cachet. It gets winked at more than expressed, and it really doesn't change what's in people's hearts. If anything, it just drives it underground and makes it more dangerous, I think, by avoiding public confrontation with what it is that people really believe.
And to some extent, it's almost as if if I've heard the evidence as to why Holocaust deniers have no case, and I say, oh, that's a good thing, so let's ban talking about the Holocaust denial, then you're in effect not allowing anybody else to hear that same kind of evidence and convey that message to them as well.
Exactly right. That's what, when Mill talks about things being dead dogmas, even if we take a case, the best kind of case, where we're just certain that all of the historical evidence is on one side of it, and then we say, okay, so we're just going to ban Holocaust denial now. Even if we understand the evidence, the overwhelming evidence in favor of the existence of the Holocaust, it's crucial that the students that we teach and the generations that we talk to don't just get a truth from us, a received truth, leaving them unable to combat arguments that, oh, well, a few Jews were killed, but they're always exaggerating that. I mean, you hear that kind of argument around. They need to confront. We all need to confront the best arguments for views we despise, so that we can be armed against them.
Well, thanks very much for talking about this, and thanks for joining us. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.